Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and Kerbals of all ages. Today I'm going to be making a short video on just kind of key tips and tricks I found to be very helpful when making a rocket. Now to start off, we'll start from where you usually start, the top. In this case, the pod. So for this video, I'm going to be making a simple little moon hopper. So that has a little probe pod that can travel to a bunch of the moons and return to Kerbin. So requirements for that is it needs, of course, to be able to get in Kerbin orbit, and then it needs to be able to transit to the moons and fly around the wood. So that has lots of delta V in its top stage, given this is what's called direct descent. So starting off, when you're building that that upper pod stage, you're going to want to make sure you have everything you'll need for the journey. Now, one thing I find to be really useful is these service bays, because you can cram a lot of stuff in it. As you can see, I've crammed in nearly everything we'll need. We have power, we have solar panels, we have monopropellant for in case we want to dock with anything, and we have all of our science equipment. Additionally, one thing I found very useful is, let's say, for example, this is a tourist mission, which is kind of what this rocket's designed for, when tourists say, I want to go to both Moon and Minmus. Now, bringing on additional crew adds additional weight because you need to have pod space for that. So one thing I found really useful is you can actually cram in little remote guidance units in here and allow the rocket to fly autonomously. Very useful if you don't want to have to waste crew space. Even if it is a manned capsule. You can also use this if you want to transfer crew that are non-pilots, for example, engineers or scientists. For if you're going to cycle crew from the base or something. Now, one thing you're going to want to make sure is ensure that these things can open cleanly. Now, solar panels, especially the deployable kind, can break very easily. The little side ones, not so much, but solar panels break very easily. So also make sure you have a bunch of them. One, you aren't going to want to have them all on one side, because in case you run out of power and you're stuck on the wrong side, you're going to kind of be screwed. And that also goes into another thing, is make sure you have lots of redundancy, even if it is just small little individual solar panels for power. Additionally, have batteries for when you're in the dark and you'll need power. The worst thing that can happen is you build a perfect rocket, get to your destination only to realize that you have run out of power because the solar panels weren't facing the right way, or one of them broke or whatnot. Very sad. Also, make sure you have enough power generation, because and this is more for bases. For example, if you're making a fuel refinery, you don't want to make a fuel refinery can only operate at half capacity because it doesn't have enough power. Or, for example, it doesn't have enough power to operate through the night. So that's a big thing. And batteries are fairly light, so it's something you want to make sure. Also, parachutes. Now, you're always going to want to make sure you have enough parachutes for this thing to survive. Now, I'm just using stage recovery, and this actually will be fine. 7.3 meters per second. This will be able to handle it just fine. Now, I get asked a lot of times, how many parachutes do I need and what kinds? Now, in this case, you just see those three main ones. But another thing you can use is drogue chutes. Well, not actually in place of normal parachutes, but drogue chutes, for those who don't know, are very useful in the fact that they are great for slowing your rocket down. Now, you don't actually need a lot of them. You actually only need one. Because the whole purpose is you throw it out at higher speeds, and then that will subsequently slow your rocket down. Now, deployment height, that very much varies. I mean, if you want to be safe, you would put these at higher altitude. I like to play it nice and dangerous, but that's just me. Another thing you can do is you actually can modify each of them individually, or for example, you have one big one, jump out at a higher altitude to slow your rocket down to, let's say, something in the tens of meters per second, and then these can deploy at much lower altitude, just so you aren't sitting waiting for your rocket to fall from 1,000 meters up at 3 meters per second, because that takes a while, even with time warp. Another thing you want to be careful of is is there any delicate items? Now, in this case, you have a service bay, which are fairly hardy. But if you have smaller, lighter things that aren't as susceptible to crash into the ground, make sure those aren't on the bottom of your rocket. Another thing, communications equipment. make sure you have a very good antenna, especially if you are using, making it where you need a proper signal with your drone, or if you're using a probe. Make sure you have a strong enough antenna and make sure it is deployed. For example, in this case, you need to extend that antenna. On a side note too, if you're playing where if you aren't using base stations especially, and you need a proper communications network, make sure you have a proper communications network before sending in a drone. I've actually had the problem once where I sent a little batch of probes to Duna to explore all the different environments, only to realize that, one, I didn't have enough time to deploy the probes because the orbit, the encounter was too fast, but also by the time they were landing, they didn't have signal, so they all just crashed into the ground because I couldn't tell them to deploy their chutes. Kind of sucked. But yes, on the next thing, final thing for pod design, monopropellant. Make sure you have, even I think this, if you have a pod that does have boosters, you'll still probably want small ones. You want to make sure you have enough RCS thrusters so you can actually in every direction, generally, especially if you're trying to be doing docking. Again, actually in this case it's actually a little too small. I probably would need to include a few more, but make sure you have sufficient monopropellant. Usually, I mean, for something like this, you have a decent amount. 30 is a decent amount, but also, always good to pack more. Last thing you want to be doing is trying to dock with a station that you need to refuel at, only to realize that you have run out of monopropellant. Again, it's similar to the power thing, small details that screw up your perfect mission. Kind of sucks. Now on to kind of moving our way down. Heat shields. Now again, if you're coming in from pretty much anything outside of very low Kerbin orbit, heat shields are very, very useful because your rocket will heat up. Now, some people will, you can in theory just, use the lower stage as the heat shield and let it burn up, though I find that to be a little bit risky. Generally, it's not best practices. So work our way down. And also, make sure, now the heat shields can decouple on their own, but make sure you have a decoupler right beneath them because otherwise, they won't shoot up it's over beneath them. Let's go on to main body design. So, also, as you can see, I have actually put ladders in here to make it where it kicks down. And that actually should be. Let me modify that. But yes. So for my lower stage, I got very creative, and that's actually one of my favorite tips: is be creative with your rocket design. You don't have to have one big engine under here. You can use. I love these little quad adapters. Now, granted, you do have to be a little creative in staging, but again, that just adds to it. In this case, this little stage, it does work out fairly well. And you can use the engines to land on, but also can be useful to have these little pads. And you actually, one thing I found very easy, if you don't want to use big legs, you can use these small little struts, because these do have a decent little actuation to use them just kind of to cushion the fall, and then you can land on the engines. Now the nuclear engines, I like them a lot because you get very good specific impulse. You can see it's practically 100. Now in this tank, they only use liquid fuel, which also another point. SSTOs, if you use nuclear engines and jet engines, you don't have to worry about oxidizer. They all run off the same fuel, so you don't have to worry about fuel balancing. But yeah, never be afraid to get a little creative. Even if it means your rocket has this weird little bulge in the middle. It's KSP. Do whatever the heck you want. Now on to booster design. Now, again, it doesn't matter how good your upper stage is if you can't get it into orbit. Now, one thing you're always going to make sure of is, well, generally I like to say is, if you plan this to go from low Kerbin orbit to other places, make sure it gets to low Kerbin orbit. And that means you're going to need a booster that can take you there. Now, if I zoom out a little bit, you can see I have a bunch of different little designs. And these are all roughly the same price point, roughly same delta V, but it's always good to consider different booster designs. Now here I did probably I would say a very well designed, but we call it the traditional, center core, strap-on boosters, asparagus stage, which means that all the rocket engines on the bottom are firing at the beginning, and these side tanks actually feed the middle. So it's pretty much these go up, and then when they split off, it's as if this was a whole stage all of its own. Just, fresh, weren't used. But you do get to use those engines in takeoff, so you don't have to worry about carrying, engines. It's much more efficient because you don't need to use as heavy of engines, even though these are mainsails. It also means I don't have to strap on lots of boosters, which, if you're playing career mode and you're a lot more cost conscious, that's a very useful thing to do. Now, when building your boosters, it's always good to make sure that they separate cleanly. How many times have I launched rockets, especially when you use these larger side stages where the decouplers don't have as much relative pushing power compared to the size of it. So separatrons are quite useful. In this case, point them kind of up like this. It will cause them kind of tip up and over, kind of to peel away. And especially given this is asparagus stage, this rocket will continue to power its way up while these are decoupling. So you're going to want to make sure that does not run into them. But now on to different designs. So again, here we have liquid stage core with liquid stage boosters. That gets us about a little over 4,000 meters per second, and total rocket cost is a little under 200,000. Now on to our solid rocket booster side things. Now this, not as much delta V. We're short about 250 almost, a little less than 250. But if that's all you need, can get some significant savings. And while liquid boosters generally will produce a little more power, your SRBs, they can produce lots of thrust. They're cheap, they're easy. Now in this case, actually, because it's an asparagus stage, it does have lower thrust to weight, and that actually can hurt you. Earlier on with rockets, you will want decent enough thrust to weight for that first stage, because if you think about gravity losses, if you subtract 1 from that number, that's your relative efficiency. So in this, only about 1/4 of its thrusting power is actually going to be able to lift it. The other 3/4 is dedicated to fighting gravity. That's why I generally try to go for starting thrust weight of around 2, just so at least you get half that lifting power. Now another design, this uses 2.5 meter designs with side boosters, but also you may just want to say, hey, I'm just going to have one really big rocket underneath. And for the big stages, you actually can achieve similar performance. Now in this case, it's like about 200 gigawatts cheaper than the dual stage liquid fueled, but if you actually look at in this case, it achieves performance similar to this. And now if we were deciding between this and this, I'd probably go with this one. Now overall, I would probably go with this one, given we want to make a rocket that can in fact go up. But yes, now I guess on the bottom, final little designs. Let's say make sure you got your fuel lines hooked up if you want to do asparagus staging. It gets very useful. Struts are always nice, especially when you're building larger boosters that contain multiple parts. These will make sure that you keep it together, especially if you're earlier on in career mode where you don't have the larger fuel tanks and you have to use a lot of the smaller ones. Those are going to wiggle around a lot. That's always useful. Another little tip and trick: if you're making a nose cone and it's a liquid fuel rocket, why not put fuel in it if you can? So again, use those little adapters and then just normal nose cones when you can. Another thing is picking your engines. Now in this case, I used the little twin bore rocket engines. Now these are very popular. They're pretty much the most powerful 2-stage. I mean, given their design, you can't really put anything on the bottom. Now in theory, what you could do is use a little strap thing on the bottom and you just cram an extra engine in there, which actually isn't a terrible idea. Again, being creative with stuff. Or use mainsails. I mean, really, I would say remember to use the engines for the task. If it's going to be launch stage, initial launch stage, make sure you use launch engines. And for those that don't know what really launch engines are, they're the ones that are very high thrust, that have decent ISP, and atmosphere. Now, generally they'll also have decent ISP and takeoff, but so you look at this. Is this a launch engine? No, this is an upper stage engine. So you go like that. So you look at the ISP, 200 for atmosphere. That's pretty bad. You have solid rocket boosters there, better than that, but 340 in vacuum. Hey, that's pretty good. Then we go to here, 280 atmosphere, 300 vacuum. All right, launch stage. Terrier's probably the best example of this. 85 in atmosphere. It's horrendous. But 345 in vacuum. Very, very good. Very, very good. Then you have the Nerva, which get not the best in atmosphere, but kills it in vacuum. So that's always a good thing to know. Now, general engine types and like uses, chemicals or chemical rockets, liquid fuel oxidizer are really useful in any situation. Again, just find the right kind of engine, you'll be good to go. Also, they're very versatile, especially if you have enough thrust on a stage, you can throw on little extra things. If you want to be going places, for if it's a probe, the little ion engines work pretty well. If you want to go, I like the nuclear engines for larger payloads because one, they have decent amount of thrust, you don't have to be sitting there for a while. Also, they have significant enough thrust where you can land on moons. Like I said, in a case like this, thrust to weight is 0.68. Now that's on Kerbin. Now on the moon, that's way more in terms of thrust to weight. So pretty good in here. You can look at the moon. Thrust to weight 4. That's great. Now, one thing to remember is if you're going to be landing on a body, especially if you're going to be coming kind of fast, you're going to want a thrust to weight that's actually fairly high. And that's because you're going to, one, have to be fighting gravity, but also be killing your velocity. And you don't want to be having to do constant suicide burns because that also results in heavy gravity losses, where you're just kind of having to hover there and gravity's taking its toll. For those that do not know, a suicide burn is where you pretty much burn your engines at the last minute. If you have some sort of automated system or are just an absolute Jebediah badass, sure, do it. Otherwise, I would burn it in stages where you say, all right, at this altitude, I'm going to be at this relative velocity kind of thing. And there also are tools. I like to use the little maneuver planner. So what you'll do is you'll put it at various heights and say, all right, how much speed do I need to do to practically kill my velocity? And you obviously don't burn to that because you'll roll in heavy gravity losses, but just keeping tabs on how long the burn will be to kill your velocity at different heights, so that you can plan and say, hey, I need to, when I'm this far away from touchdown, I'll need to start burning my engines. And that also can help with the suicide burns. Alright, well that's really it. If there's any other little final things, again, docking ports. If you like to dock, again, I highly recommend if you want to have a nice versatile rocket. Now, in this case, don't always need it. And also, I say one final tip is don't feel like you need to say don't listen to me, but always find out what works best for you. I mean, lots of these rocket designs can be very, very versatile. You can do a lot of different things with them. I mean, other just kind of ideas is using you could use jet engines for takeoff. You can just strap a bunch of them. Now, if you're running stock, that can be a little hard, but if you have certain mods that give you larger jet engines, or tweak scale, for example, jets can actually be very, very useful, especially if you use the whiplash ones. Now, mind you, you might actually need little boosters, and that's actually, as one final little thing you can do, just kind of give you more boosters, is if you have a good stage, but initial thrust to weight is kind of lacking just because engines aren't powerful enough. One thing you can do is strap on little solid rocket boosters to the side and then burn those with your liquid fueled engines to kind of help boost it up until the liquid fuel engines have burnt off enough fuel till so that has appreciable thrust to weight. And that I have tried that once or twice. It's never been a huge thing just because I usually use tweak scale to make sure I have big enough engines and powerful enough engines. But if you're running stock, that actually can work pretty well. And that, matter of factly, it's not the worst thing that can happen. if you look at just kind of look at, obviously these are gonna be too small, but you can put in, especially if they don't burn for very long. Now you can also use, larger ends just to burn with it. For example, these ones actually have pretty good burn time, 85 seconds. What are these burn time? Yeah, 79 seconds. It can be very useful. A lot of times too, you can use smaller clusters, for example. That's why I said like the thumbpricks. I know that doesn't burn for as long as it, but really though, that is really it. Oh, one last thing. Make sure your parts in between stages aren't really colliding. This is a big thing with stuff like this, where it's like you're getting a little creative. Now, if we actually zoom in a little bit, you're going to see that this sits like a glove. I actually did test it. It does work. You do kind of have to push off a little bit, but yeah, make sure that everything fits very well, because they also, in cases like this, where if you have stuff colliding, when you detach, all of a sudden this is a collidable object, and your engines go boom, and then you are sad. Also with these stages, make sure that they, like I said earlier, break off cleanly, that, again, they aren't going to be colliding with fins, and make sure you have tail fins, especially if you're doing lots of maneuvering at kind of at the start, trying to get in specific orbits, turning your rocket around, because that also will prevent your rocket from flipping over. If you find your rocket's flipping over, it means you need larger tail fins on the bottom, or maybe even put some stuff, mid-stage, like up here, just little tiny control surfaces, just to give it a little more control from flipping out. Alright, well, thank you very much. I know I kind of rambled on for a little bit, but thanks for watching, and have a nice day.